Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The New Science by Giambattista Vico. We are still in Book 2, but this is the last section in Book 2, and we will begin this particular video with Section 11, entitled Poetic Geography. Chapter 1 is also entitled Poetic Geography, and we will begin on paragraph 741. It remains for us now to cleanse the other eye of poetic history, namely poetic geography. By that property of human nature included among the axioms that, quote, in describing unknown or distant things in respect of which they either have not had the true idea themselves, or wish to explain it to others who do not have it, men make use of the semblances of things known or near at hand. End quote. Poetic geography, in all its parts, and as a whole, begin with restricted ideas within the confines of Greece. Then, as the Greeks went abroad into the world, it was gradually amplified until it reached the form in which it is now described to us. The ancient geographers agree on this truth, although they were unable to avail themselves of it, for they affirm that the ancient nations emigrating to strange and distant lands gave their own native names to the new-found cities, mountains, rivers, hills, straits, isles, and promontories. 742. Within Greece itself, accordingly, lay the original East, called Asia or India, the West called Europe or Hesperia, the North called Thrace or Scythia, and the South called Libya or Mauritania. And these names for the regions of the little world of Greece were later applied to those of the world at large in virtue of the correspondence which the Greeks observed between the two. We have clear proof of this in the cardinal winds, which retain in their geography the names which they must certainly have had within Greece itself. Thus the mares of Rhesus on the shores of the ocean, a name, as we shall presently find, applied to any sea of unobstructed horizon, must have been impregnated by Zephyr, the west wind of Greece. And likewise on the shores of the ocean, in the above noted primary sense, the horse of Achilles must have been generated by Zephyr, even as the mares of Erechtheus, as Aeneas tells Achilles, must have been impregnated by Boreas, the north wind of Greece. This truth concerning the cardinal winds is confirmed by the immense projection to which the Greek mind extended itself in taking from the mountain on which the Homeric gods dwelt, and applying to the starry heaven the name Olympus, by which it continued to be known. 743. On these principles, the great peninsula to the east of Greece came to be called Asia Minor, when the name Asia was extended to that great eastern part of the world, which has continued to be called Asia without qualification. On the other hand, Greece itself, which was to the west of Asia, was called Europe, the Europe which Jove, in the form of a bull, abducted. Later, the name was extended to embrace this other great continent as far as the Western Ocean. They gave the name Hesperia to the western part of Greece, where the evening star Hesperus rises on the fourth quarter of the horizon. Later, they saw Italy in the same quarter, but much larger than Hesperia of Greece, and they called it Hesperia Magna. And finally, when they reached Spain in the same direction, they called it Hesperia Ultima. Conversely, the Greeks of Italy must have called by name Ionia that part of Greece lying across the sea to the east of them. Hence the name Ionian for the sea between the two Greeces, Greece proper and Magna Graecia, the Greek part of southern Italy. Later, because of the similarity of position of Greece proper and Asiatic Greece, the inhabitants of Greece proper took to calling by the name Ionia the part of Asia Minor to the east of them. It seems reasonable that out of the first Ionia Pythagoras must have come to Italy from Samos, or Cephallenia, one of the islands ruled by Ulysses, and not from Samos or the second Ionia. 744. From the Thrace within Greece must have come Mars, who was certainly a Greek divinity, and thence too must have come Orpheus, or one of the first Greek theological poets. 745. From the Scythia within Greece came Anarchus, who left the Scythian oracles in Greece. These must have been similar to the oracles of Zoroaster, which must originally have been an oracular history. Anacharsis has been received among the most ancient oracular gods. By imposture, these oracles were later translated into dogmas of philosophy. Similarly, the Orphica were supposed to be verses of Orpheus, though, like the oracles of Zoroaster, they have no poetic flavor and give forth too distinct an odor of the Platonic and Pythagorean school. So too from the Scythia within Greece, by way of the original Hyperboreans, the two famous oracles of Delphi and Dodona must have come into Greece, as we supposed in the notes on the chronological table. For in Scythia, that is among these Hyperboreans of Greece proper, Anacharsis, attempting to order humanity by Greek laws, was slain by Caduidus, his brother. So little did he profit by the barbarous philosophy of which Van Huren speaks, that he could not devise such laws for them himself. By the same reasoning, Abaris must have been a Scythian too, for he is said to have written the Scythian oracles, which must have been no other than those of Anacharsis just mentioned. And he wrote them in that Scythia in which Adenthrasis long afterwards wrote with those physical objects. Whence we must conclude that they were written by an impostor some time after the introduction of the Greek philosophies. Hence the oracles of Anacharsis were accepted by the conceit of the scholars as oracles of esoteric wisdom, which have not come down to us. 746. Zalmoxis, who according to Herodotus brought to the Greeks the dogma of the immortality of the soul, was a Gaetan in the same sense in which Mars was. 747. It was likewise from a Greek India that Bacchus must have come in triumph from the Indian East, that is, from a Greek land rich in poetic gold. He rides triumphant in a golden chariot, a cart of grain. Hence he is also tamer of serpents and tigers, as Hercules is of hydras and lions, as set forth above. 748. Certainly the name Morea, preserved by the Peloponnesus down to our days, is ample proof that Perseus, certainly a Greek hero, carried out his enterprises in the Mauritania within Greece, for the Peloponnesus is in the same geographical relation to Achaia as Africa is to Europe. Here can be seen how little Herodotus understood of his own antiquities, on which account indeed Thucydides reproves him, for he relates that the Moors were at one time white, as were certainly the Moors of his own Greece, which to this day is called White Morea. 749. It must likewise have been from the pestilence of this Mauritania that Asclepius saved his island of Kos by his art. For if he had had to save it from the pestilence of the people of Morocco, he would have had to save it from all the pestilences in the world. 750. It was in this Mauritania that Hercules must have taken on his shoulders the burden of the sky that old Atlas was tired of bearing. For the name Atlas must originally have been used for Mount Athos, which on a neck of land later cut through by Xerxes divides Macedonia from Thrace, and here, as a matter of fact, between Greece and Thrace, there was also a river called Atlas. Later, at the Straits of Gibraltar, when it was observed that Mounts Abila and Calpa on the narrows of the sea similarly separate Africa from Europe, it was said that there Hercules had fixed the columns, which, as we have said above, support the heavens, and the name Atlas was applied to the nearby mountain in Africa. And in this way we can find some plausibility in the answer that Thetis gives her son Achilles in Homer, that she cannot carry his complaint to Jove, because he and the other gods have gone from Olympus to feast on Atlas, based on the opinion to which we have before alluded, that the gods dwelt on the tops of the highest mountains. For if this reply had referred to Mount Atlas in Africa, it would have been beyond belief, in view of the fact that Homer himself tells us that Mercury, even with wings, found the greatest difficulty in reaching the Isle of Calypso in the Phoenician Sea, much nearer to Greece than the kingdom we now call Morocco. 751. It was likewise from the Greek Hesperia that Hercules must have brought the golden apples to Attica, and there too dwelt the Hesperides, the daughters of Atlas, who guarded them. 752. In like manner, the Eridanus, into which Pathon fell, must have been the Danube in Greek Thrace, which flows into the Euxine. Later, when the Greeks observed that the Po is the other river in the world which flows from west to east, like the Danube, they called it Eridanus, and the mythologists had it that Pathon fell in Italy. But it was only the tales of their own heroic history, not that of other nations, which the Greeks attached to the stars, among which is Eridanus. 753. Finally, when the Greeks reached the ocean, they expanded the narrow idea of any sea with an unobstructed prospect, in virtue of which Homer had said the isle of Aeolia was girt by the ocean, and along with the idea, the name ocean was also extended to signify the sea that girds the whole earth, which was conceived as a great island. The power of Neptune was thus immensely enlarged, so that from the abyss of the waters, which Plato placed in very bowels of the earth, he could shake it with his great trident. The crude principles of this physics have been explained above. 754. By these principles of geography, Homer can be completely vindicated against the very grave errors which have been wrongfully imputed to him. 755. 1. The lotus-eaters of Homer, who ate the bark of a plant called lotus, must have been nearer than in the usual view, for he says that it was a 9 days' journey from Ulysses from Malea to the lotus-eaters, and if the latter, as has been held, had dwelt among the Straits of Gibraltar, it would have been not merely difficult but impossible to believe that the journey was made in 9 days. This error is charged against Homer by Eratosthenes. 756. 2. The Laestrygonians in Homer's time must have been a people of Greece, and when he says that they have the longest days, he must mean the longest in Greece and not in the whole world. This passage led Aratus to locate them under the head of Draco. Certainly Thucydides, a serious and precise writer, speaks of the Laestrygonians in Sicily, who must have been the most northerly people of that island. 757. 3. By the same reasoning, the Cimmerians had the longest nights of any people, not of the whole world but only of Greece, because they were situated in its most northerly part. Because of their long nights, they were said to dwell near the infernal regions. Their name was later transferred to the remote inhabitants about the Sea of Azov. Hence the people of Cumae, since they had their dwelling near the grotto of the Sibyl, which led to the infernal regions, must have been called Cimmerians, because of the supposed similarity of location. For it is not much to be believed that Ulysses, sent forth by Circe without any incantation, inasmuch as Mercury had given him a charm against her spells, as we have noted above, in 1 day could have traveled to the latter day and remote Cimmerians of the Sea of Azov to visit the lower regions, and on the same day have made his return to Circe, now Mount Cercello, not far from Cumae. 758. On these same principles of poetic Greek geography, it is possible to solve many great difficulties in the ancient history of the East, arising from the fact that many peoples who have been situated in the Near East itself have been taken for very distant peoples, particularly toward the north and south. 759. What we have noted of Greek poetic geography is also found to be true of the ancient geography of the Latins. Latium must at first have been a very small country, inasmuch as in 250 years under the kings, Rome subdued a good 20 peoples, and yet did not extend her rule more than 20 miles, as we have remarked above. Italy was certainly circumscribed by Cispaline Gaul and Magna Graecia. Roman conquests later extended the name to its present scope. Similarly, the Etruscan or Tyrrhenian Sea must have been quite small at the time when Horatius Cocles alone withstood all Etruria on the bridge. Roman victories later extended it to include the waters bathing all the lower coast of Italy. 760. In precisely the same way, the original Pontus, to which Jason made his naval expedition, must have been the land nearest Europe, from which it is divided by the strait called Propontis. This land must have given its name to the Sea of Pontus. Thence the name was extended to its farther shores in Asia, where the kingdom of Mithridates later stood. This same fable of the Argonauts tells us that Aeetes, father of Medea, was born in Chalcis, a city of Euboea, an island within Greece now called Negropont, which must have given its first name to what is certainly still called the Black Sea. The original Crete must have been an island within the Greek archipelago, which contains the labyrinth of islands, the Cyclades above explained, from which Minos must have made his raids on the Athenians. Only later did Crete move out into the Mediterranean, where it still remains. 761. Now, since we have returned from the Latins to the Greeks, we may note that the latter, as we went out over the world, spread everywhere, vainglorious men as they were. The fame of the Trojan War and the wandering of the heroes, both those of the Trojans and, as Antenor, Capys, and Aeneas, and those of the Greeks, such as Menelaus, Diomed, and Ulysses. They observed scattered throughout the world a type of nation founder like their Theban Hercules. And so they spread abroad the name of their Hercules, so that Varro was able to enumerate a good 40 Herculeses among the ancient nations, and affirmed that the Latin Hercules had been called the god Phidias. Thus it came about that, with a vainglory equaling that of the Egyptians, who said that their Jove Ammon was the most ancient Jove in the world, and that all the Herculeses of the other nations had taken their name from the Egyptian Hercules, in accord with 2 axioms set forth above, erroneously believing themselves to be the oldest nation in the world, the Greeks caused their Hercules to wander through all the parts of the earth, freeing it of monsters, but bringing home nothing but the glory. 762. They observed everywhere that there had been a poetic character of shepherds speaking in verse, such as their own Arcadian Evander, and so Evander came from the Arcadia of Latium, and there gave shelter to his compatriot Hercules, and took his wife Carmenta, so called from Carmina, quote-unquote, verses. She was the Latin inventress of letters, that is, of the forms of the so-called articulated sounds which are the matter of verses. And finally, in confirmation of all we have been saying, the Greeks observed these poetic characters within Latium at the same time that, as we have seen above, they found their curates scattered through Saturnia, ancient Italy, Crete, and Asia. 763. But these Greek words and ideas came to the Latins in extremely barbarous times in which the nations were closed to strangers. Livy denies that even the famous name of Pythagoras, to say nothing of the man himself, could have reached Rome from Croton in the days of Servius Tullius, though the many nations on the way, with their diverse languages and customs. To meet this very difficulty, we have postulated above, as a necessary conjecture, that there may have been on the shore of Latium a Greek city, later shrouded in the mist of antiquity, which taught the Latins their letters. These, as Tacitus relates, were at first like the earliest Greek ones, which argue strongly that the Latins received their letters from the Greeks of Latium, and not from those of Magna Graecia, and much less from those of Greece proper, with whom they had no acquaintance before the war with Tarentum, which led into that with Pyrrhus. For otherwise the Latins would have used the latest Greek letters, and would have not retained their original letters, which were the ancient Greek ones. 764. Thus the name of Hercules, Evander, and Aeneas came into Latium from Greece, in virtue of the following customs of nations. 765. 1. Just as in their barbarism, they are enamored of their native customs, so when they begin to become civilized, they take pleasure in foreign tongues as well as in their foreign wares and fashions. Hence the Latins exchanged their god Phidias for the Greek Hercules, and in place of the native oath, Medius Phidias, they introduced Mericule, Oedipole, Mecastor. 766. 2. In virtue of that conceit of nations we have so often noted, which makes them boast illustrious foreign origins, particularly when the traditions of their own barbarous times supply some motive for believing in them, the Latins were pleased to disavow Phidias, their true founder, in favor of Hercules, the true founder of the Greeks, and likewise to exchange the character of their own shepherd poets for Evander of Arcadia. Similarly, in the returned barbarism, Giovanni Villani relates that Fiesole had been founded by Atlas and that a Trojan king Priam had reigned in Germany. 767. 3. When nations observe foreign things which they cannot explain with certainty in their native vocabulary, they must of necessity make use of foreign terms. 768. 4. Lastly, there is the property of the earliest peoples, which was discussed above in the poetic logic, by which they are incapable of abstracting qualities from subjects, and therefore can only designate the qualities by naming the subjects to which they belong. We have clear cases of this in Latin. 769. As the Romans did not know what luxury was until they observed it in the Tarentines, they called a perfumed man a Tarentine. As they did not know what military stratagems were until they observed them in the Carthaginians, they called them Carthaginian arts. As they did not know what pomp was until they observed it in the Capuans, they used the phrase supercilium capunicum for pomp and pride. In like fashion, Numa and Ancus were called Sabine, because the Romans could not otherwise express a religiousness such as that for which the Sabines were distinguished. Servius Tullius was called Greek because they had no word for astuteness, an idea which must have remained unexpressed until they came to know the Greeks of the conquered city of which they were just speaking. And he was also called a slave because they could not otherwise express his weakness in yielding voluntary ownership of the fields to the plebeians by bringing them the first agrarian law, as shown above, on which account, perhaps, the fathers had him slain. For astuteness is a property which goes with weakness, and both alike were foreign to Roman straightforwardness and valor. For those who affirm that Rome did not have within herself heroes worthy of kingship, so that they had to submit to the rule of a low-born slave, do a great injustice to the origins of Rome, and offend overmuch the wisdom of Romulus her founder. Such is the honor done him by critics who have occupied themselves with the writers. It is of a piece with the later tribute to the effect that the Romans, having founded a powerful empire in Latium, and maintained it against all the power of Etruria, had to seek, like lawless barbarians, through Italy, Magna Graecia, and Greece proper for laws to order their liberty, all to sustain the credit of the fable that the law of the 12 tables came to Rome from Athens. Chapter 2. Corollary on the coming of Aeneas to Italy. 770. In the light of all previous discussion, it can now be shown how Aeneas came into Italy and founded the Roman nation in Alba, from which the Romans draw their origin. Our Greek city on the shore of Latium must have been a Greek city from Asia, where Troy was, and must have been unknown to the Romans until they extended their conquests from the hinterland down to the nearby sea. This they began to do under Ancus Marcius, third of the Roman kings. He initiated such conquest with Ostia, the maritime city so close to Rome that as the latter afterwards expanded immoderately, it made Ostia its port. Thus, just as the Romans had received the Latin Arcadians, who were fugitives by land, so later they took under their protection the Phrygians, who were fugitives by sea, and by heroic right of war they demolished the city. And thus both Arcadians and Phrygians, by two anachronisms, the former by that of post-dating and the latter by that of pre-dating, took refuge in the asylum of Romulus. 771. For if this is not the way things went, then the origin of Rome from Aeneas confounds and baffles any understanding, as we have pointed out in the axioms. In order to avoid such bafflement and confusion, the scholars from Livy on down have treated that origin as fabulous, failing to consider that, as we have said in the axioms, the fables must have had some public motive of truth. For Evander is so powerful in Latium that he receives and shelters Hercules there some 500 years before the founding of Rome, and Aeneas founds the royal house of Alba, which, under a succession of 14 kings, so waxes in prestige as to become the capital of Latium, and the Arcadians and Phrygians, after so long a vagabondage, finally repair to the asylum of Romulus. We may well ask how a shepherd folk, knowing nothing of seafaring and coming from Arcadia, an inland part of Greece, could cross such an expanse of water and penetrate into mid-Latium, when Ancus Marcius, third king after Romulus, was the first to take a colony down to the nearby seacoast. And how they got to Latium, along with the dispersed Phrygians, a good 200 years before the time of which Livy writes, when he tells us that not even the name of Pythagoras, so celebrated in Magna Graecia, could reach Rome from Croton, through the many intervening nations of diverse languages and customs. And for that matter, 400 years before the Tarentines had heard of the Romans, who were already a powerful people in Italy. 772. Nevertheless, as we have often stated in conformity with one of the axioms set forth above, these vulgar traditions must have from the beginning have a great public grounds of truth, since an entire nation has so long preserved them. What then must we say? We must assume that some Greek city had stood on the shore of Latium, just as so many others stood and remained afterward on the shores of the Tyrrhenian Sea. This city must have been conquered by the Romans before the time of the Law of the 12 Tables, and by the heroic right of such barbarous victories, the Romans must have demolished it and received the vanquished inhabitants in the quality of heroic socii, and in the language of poetic characters, these Greeks must have called Arcadians the vagabonds who wandered by land through the forests, and the Phrygians those who wandered by sea, just as the Romans described as received into the asylum of Romulus the vanquished who surrendered to them and whom they took in as laborers under the clientels established by Romulus when he opened the asylum in the clearing for those who came thither as refugees. Out of such conquered and surrendered men, whom we may assign to the period between the expulsion of the kings and the law of the 12 Tables, the Roman plebeians must have emerged under the agrarian law of Servius Tullius, who had granted them voluntary ownership of the fields. Because this was not to the liking of Coriolanus, he sought, as we said above, to reduce the plebeians to their previous condition, as Romulus's laborers. Subsequently, as the Greeks broadcast everywhere the tale of the Trojan War, and the wanderings of the heroes, and particularly in Italy the voyage of Aeneas, because in that country they had already discovered their Hercules, their Evander, and their Curetes, as noted above, it thus came about in the course of time that these traditions were altered, and finally corrupted on the lips of a barbarous people. So, as we say, Aeneas became the founder of the Roman people in Latium, though, according to Bochart, he never set foot in Italy, though Strabo says he never left Troy, and though Homer, of more weight here, relates that he died in Troy, and left his kingdom to his descendants. Thus, by two different manifestations of the conceit of the nations, that of the Greeks in making such a stir about the Trojan War, and that of the Romans in boasting an illustrious foreign origin, the Greeks foisted their Aeneas upon the Romans, and the latter finally accepted him as their founder. 773. This fable could not have arisen before the time of the war with Pyrrhus, for it was only then that the Romans began to find pleasure in Greek things. It is a habit we find nations acquiring only after long and extensive dealings with foreigners. Chapter 3. The Denomination and Description of the Heroic Cities. 774. Now, since the parts of geography are nomenclature and chorography, that is to say, the denomination and description of places, principally of cities, it remains for us to examine these matters in order to complete our discussion of poetic wisdom. 775. We have seen above that the heroic cities were founded by providence and natural strongholds, to which the ancient Latins in their divine age must have given the sacred name aerae, or altars. They must have also called these strong positions arses, or fortresses. For in the return to barbarian times, these signories were called in Italian rocca from rocci, meaning steep and precipitous rocks, and later castella. In like manner, the name aerae must have been extended to the whole district held by a heroic city, which, as above noted, was called ager, when considered with reference to the frontiers dividing it from the foreigners, and territorium, when considered with reference to the jurisdiction of the city over its citizens. On all this there is a golden passage in Tacitus describing the aura maxima of Hercules in Rome, and because this passage gives strong support to these principles, we shall quote it in full. Quote, "From the ox market, then, where we see the brazen statue of a bull, because that is the animal commonly yoked to the plough, a furrow was drawn to mark out the town, so as to embrace the great altar of Hercules, and the land itself within that furrowed circuit was the original altar of Hercules." End quote. There is another golden passage in Sallust telling of the famous altars of the brothers Phileni, Philenorum Aerae, left as a boundary marker between the Carthaginian and Cyrenaic empires. 776. All ancient geography is strewn with such altars. To begin with, Asia, Keller, in his Notitia Orbis Antiqui, states that all the cities of Syria had the word Aram placed before or after their specific designations, whence Syria itself was called Aramea or Aramea. But in Greece, Theseus founded the city of Athens on the famous altar of the unhappy, properly considering unhappy those lawless and impious men who, from the brawling of their infamous communism, took recourse to the fortified lands of the strong, as we have said above, all solitary, weak, and needful of all the benefits that the pious had derived from their humanity. And thus in Greek the word ara also meant vow, because on these first altars of the Gentile world, as we have also set forth above, the first victims, called Saturni Hostiae, as noted above, the first animatheta, translated into Latin as dearest devoti, who were the violent and impious men who had dared to enter the cultivated fields of the strong in pursuit of the weak, who had fled thither to escape them, whence perhaps the use of campara and the sense of saving oneself, were consecrated to Vesta and slain. Hence in Latin supplicium meant both punishment and sacrifice, as used by Sallust among others. To this double meaning in Latin there is a close correspondence in Greek, for the word ara, which, as we have said, means vow, has also the sense of noxa, or the body that has done the harm, and also that of dire, or the Furies, and precisely such as these were the first devoti, the vowed or devoted men of whom we just spoke, and of whom we shall have more to say in Book 4. For they were consecrated to the Furies, and then sacrificed on these first altars of the Gentile world. So the word hara, which survived in the sense of coop or pen, must have meant to the ancient Latins the victim. From this word certainly is derived arispex, he who divines from the entrails of victims slain before the altars. 777. From what we were saying of the Ara Maxima of Hercules, it was on an altar similar to that of Theseus that Romulus must have founded Rome within the asylum opened in the grove, for it remained true among the Latins that never was there mention of a lucus or sacred wood without allusion to an altar erected therein to some divinity. So by telling us that in general the asylums were an ancient council of founders of cities, Vitas Urbis Condentium Concilium, Livy discloses to us the reason why in ancient geography we read of so many cities with the name Are. Whence too we must admit that it was with knowledge of this antiquity that Cicero called the Senate Ara Sociorum, for it was to the Senate that the provinces carried their complaints regarding accounting against governors that had governed them avariciously, thereby recalling the origin of the provinces from these first socii in the world. 778. We have already shown that the heroic cities in Asia, and as regarded Europe, in Greece and Italy, were called Are, or altars. In Africa, according to Sallust, the aforesaid altar of the brothers Phileni, Are Philionorum, remained famous. In the north, coming back to Europe, altars of the Sicilians is still the term applied to the cities in Transylvania inhabited by an ancient Hunnish nation, made up of noble farmers and shepherds, which, with the Hungarians and the Saxons, composed that province. For Germany, we read of an Ara Ubiorum in Tacitus. In Spain, Ara is still a part of the names of many cities. But in the Syrian language, the word Ari means lion. And above, in the natural theogony of the 12 major divinities, we showed that from the defense of their altars, the Greeks conceived the idea of Mars, whom they called Ares, so that with the same idea of strength in the returned barbarian times many cities and noble houses charged their arms with lions. This word ara, uniform in sound and meaning in so many nations widely separated from each other by space, time, and customs, must have been the root of the Latin word aratrum, plough, the moldboard of which was called herbs. And the Latins must also have derived from ara the word arx, or fortress, and artio, meaning to repel, whence the phrase augur archifinius, used by writers on the boundaries of fields. Hence also the words arma and arcus, meaning arms and bow, for they justly conceive strength to consist in thrusting back harm and holding it at a distance. Conclusion 779. We have shown that poetic wisdom justly deserves two great and sovereign tributes. The one, clearly and constantly accorded to it, is that of having founded Gentile mankind, though the conceit of the nations on the one hand and that of the scholars on the other, the former with the ideas of an empty magnificence, and the latter with ideas of an impertinent philosophical wisdom, have in effect denied it this honor by their very efforts to affirm it. The other, concerning which a vulgar tradition has come down to us, is that the wisdom of the ancients made its wise men, by a single inspiration, equally great as philosophers, lawmakers, captains, historians, orators, and poets, on which account it has been so greatly sought after. But in fact it made or rather sketched them such as we have found them in the fables. For in these, as in embryos or matrices, we have discovered the outlines of all esoteric wisdom. And it may be said that in the fables the nations have in a rough way, and in the language of the human senses, described the beginnings of this world of sciences, which the specialized studies of scholars have since clarified for us by reasoning and generalization. From all this we may conclude what we set out to show in the second book, that the theological poets were the sense, and the philosophers the intellect of human wisdom. This is the end of Book 2. In the next video, we will proceed to Book 3, entitled Discovery of the True Homer. And that will, of course, begin with Section 1, entitled Search for the True Homer. Thank you for listening.